Welcome to Functional Philosophy, the show in which I, Charles II, explain and apply Ayn Rand's philosophy, objectivism. If you'd like to ask me a question on objectivism or its application, just go to charles2.com/contact. And my last name is spelled T as in tango, E as in echo, and W as in whiskey. One primary function of the government is to treat all citizens equally under the law. How does an objectivist square this with lawyers for hire? Under a system where one can pay for legal counsel, those with more money hire more/better lawyers, while those without such money cannot, with this typically leading to different final outcomes. Well, your mistake is thinking that the function of the government is to treat people equally. That is not the function of the government. That is not a function of the government. It is something the government does in performing its actual function, which is to protect individual rights. Protecting individual rights to the maximum extent possible means protecting them unequally. In the same way that enabling maximum human flourishing means allowing for different levels of human flourishing from individual to individual. Now, private lawyers are the best way for an individual to defend his own rights in most cases. What is the alternative here? We're going to have the government provide lawyers for everyone? And then what? We're going to have a test where the government makes sure that all lawyers are equally stupid so that nobody has any better legal counsel than anybody else? And that's what it would have to be. There's no way you're going to make all lawyers as good as the best lawyer. There are always geniuses with whom nobody can catch up in every area. So equality here means the same thing it means everywhere else. It means destruction. It means lowering everybody down to the level of the dumbest lawyer, not raising everybody up to the highest. If the government's function were simply to treat everyone equally, it could accomplish that by sending flowers to everyone once a year. There you go, it's treated everyone equally, but that's not the purpose of the government. It's not just to treat people equally. It's to protect their rights, and in protecting rights, it has to apply the laws equally regardless of class or race or anything like that, anything that's not relevant to rights. As opposed to the past where if somebody was a noble, the laws would apply differently to him. So this whole idea of equality as the goal is wrong. Sometimes somebody is more capable of defending his rights than someone else is capable of defending his rights, and it doesn't help that second person to curtail the ability of the former person to defend his rights. So private lawyers are legitimate and should be the norm. That said, I do think there is a place for public defenders, government-provided lawyers. I remember Diana Shea was once asked a question about this. The questioner wrote in saying that, well, if it's the government's responsibility to provide a legal defense for people who can't afford it, then surely it's the government's responsibility to provide health care for people who can't afford that, because that's life and death. That's even more important. Now, Diana Shea, who was an objectivist philosopher who used to be in the public eye, she was run out of town by people compared to whom she was a genius. And I'm not saying she was a genius. I had major problems with her, but the people who were criticizing her were far worse than she was. Anyway, I remember once she was asked this question, and she agreed with this premise and said, yeah, but that's an argument against government-provided lawyers, not for government-provided healthcare. Now, I think both the questioner and Diana Shea were missing a major difference between these two things. There's no force involved in healthcare, so the government has no role there. But in a trial, in court, that's the government running the show to decide how to implement force. So that is a totally different situation. The government has to engage in some kind of fair, legitimate process in coming to a conclusion about how to use force. So if somebody can't defend himself, the government can't just say, well, sorry if you're illiterate and poor, where I guess you just can't defend yourself, so you're going to jail. Um that's not legitimate. So in cases like that, I do believe the government should provide an attorney, because if the government's going to use force against somebody, then it should have some minimum standards by which it conducts the procedure by which it determines how it's going to use force. Now, I don't think that should, in a free society, that wouldn't be as much of an issue as it is today. One, people would be wealthier and smarter, so better able to defend themselves or hire lawyers to defend them, and also the law would be much less complex in a free society. Now, in a society of hundreds of millions of people, maybe in a much smaller society even, the law would still be complex enough to require lawyers as a specialty. I'm not saying that would go away, but for various reasons, it would be easier to defend yourself. The easier it is to learn the law, then the less investment somebody has to make in becoming a lawyer so he can charge lower prices. It would just, the simplicity of the law, the relative simplicity, would make it easier for people to defend themselves. So I don't think this would be as much of an issue, but I do think there's a place for public provision of legal defense. Because I don't think the government can just put somebody in jail without conducting a fair trial, and some kind of minimally competent defense is essential to a fair trial. That said, private lawyers should be the norm, and as I explained, there's nothing wrong with that. That's the best way to maximize the protection of individual rights, to leave people free to defend themselves to the best of their ability. And that will mean people defend themselves unequally, but we're not interested in equality. We're interested in protecting rights to the maximum extent possible. What merits psychology to be a special branch of science, when philosophy is seemingly sufficient to explain the emotions and actions of people? Well, what merits chemistry to be a special branch of science, when physics is seemingly sufficient to explain the nature of the physical world? Well, there's no intrinsic categorization out there. It simply makes sense to divide up the study of existence into different areas. Now, ultimately, everything is connected. So if you followed this line of logic, ultimately, we would just have one subject called existence, and that's all we would study. But that would obviously be a disaster. It's helpful to have categories and to specialize in certain areas. So, just as even though chemistry can be reduced to or explained by physics, ultimately, it is still useful to have a subject area where you focus on existence at the molecular level. That doesn't mean it's unrelated to physics, but it's just a specific area of study. And psychology has the same relationship to philosophy that chemistry has to physics, broadly speaking. Now, yes, you can say that people's motivations ultimately derive from their philosophical premises, but that doesn't mean philosophy studies people's motivations in detail. So philosophy will tell you that intrinsicism in epistemology and ethics is wrong, but it won't tell you what the motivational results of that are. For instance, it won't tell you that intrinsicism can result in obsessive compulsive disorder. That is psychology. Psychology studies the effects of philosophical premises, in large part. That doesn't mean it's unrelated to philosophy, it's just that there's a natural separation here. It's not a hard line where these things are totally unrelated and we can't explain, we can't refer to philosophy and psychology because they're different areas, but it is a different area of focus. So we draw the line with philosophy at these broad, general truths. We might say something about the relationship of philosophical premises and motivation, but to get into the details is psychology. So studying those details is properly considered a different subject area. And of course, it's not even as simple as, well, this philosophical premise leads to this result in motivational psychology. Because obviously not everybody who is an intrinsicist develops OCD, so there's obviously more to it than that, and that's what psychology studies. You can't just infer from the wrongness of an idea the specific results of that idea in psychology. If our brains or our biology were different, our premises could still be wrong, but they might result in different it might have different psychological results. So it's a separate area of study. You have to look empirically and induce the results of philosophical premises in terms of people's motivation. And that's what psychology does. So you can't just deduce psychology from philosophy, even though philosophy is intimately related. How can I feel my selfish contributions to the world won't contribute to a society of people who I dislike? Well, I may not be the best person to ask about this, because I often consider never releasing the books I'm writing on the premise of pearls before swine. I often sympathize with Dominique and think that it's a moral crime to do good in this world. You know, she says that Howard Rourke is the real criminal. I can't remember the exact wording she uses, but he's the real bad guy because he's the one creating these great buildings, and for what? To be occupied by the scum bad guys in the Fountainhead. And that's the real crime, to create these great things for this evil world. And I often feel that way. But and that's me in my Dominique mood. My real answer is that you can't actually contribute that much to a society of people whom you dislike. Take James Taggart and Hank Rearden from Atlas Shrugged. Now, people like Hank Rearden definitely do make possible material values that people like James Taggart enjoy but could never produce themselves, or rather would never produce themselves. And so you could say that your virtuous actions will produce positive externalities that evil people can enjoy, but the thing is that enjoyment is very superficial. People are capable of experiencing physical pleasure, even if they're immoral, but they can't experience spiritual pleasure, joy, happiness, which is the real reason to live. there's nothing you can do that will make somebody like James Taggart happy. A person has to act for himself. He has to contribute something to his own happiness. Now, you can be in a situation where happiness is impossible to you, but when it is possible to you, nobody can force it on you. Happiness requires your own action. So, outside of certain superficial benefits, there's nothing you actually can provide to evil people. In a certain sense, you might even say that somebody like Hank Reardon is actually doing harm to James Taggart. If the world that James Taggart's actions would produce actually existed, then it would be an impoverished, war-torn one, and James Taggart would probably die pretty quickly, which could actually be a good thing for him, actually creating a society of wealth where somebody like James Taggart continues to live because he's too much of a coward to die, means that his misery is just prolonged. I mean, James Taggart is miserable. He's in his own personal hell. He's not living a happy life, so you don't have to worry too much about that. The thing is, think of all of the philosopher king totalitarians who have claimed power with the goal of forcing happiness on people. Think of the nanny state. Bloomberg's going to ban you from drinking sodas that are too big or whatever. These things make people miserable. Even people whose goal is to force other people to be happy can't do it. So if you can't do it intentionally, I wouldn't worry too much about doing it by accident. In fact, it's not possible to make evil people happy. So you don't have to worry about your virtues benefiting evil people. Evil people will be miserable. And there's nothing you could do to stop that, even if you wanted to. But what's more important than any of that is that you become selfish. You are not sufficiently selfish if you are concerned primarily with punishing the bad or with making sure that evil people get what they deserve. That's a legitimate thing to be interested in, but only so far as it redounds to your benefit. You should be primarily interested in getting what you want out of life, not in punishing bad people. Life is not about going around punishing bad people, making sure bad people are miserable. It's about making sure you are happy. So get your priorities straight. Be more selfish. A selfish person is concerned with his own happiness. Being overly concerned with punishment of bad people is second-handed. It is selfless. You're concerned with other people, but they don't matter. You matter. So be more selfish. Don't care about evil people so much.
If you'd like to keep up with everything I do, just go to charles2.com. If you'd like to enable me to do more, just go to patreon.com/charles2 and become a supporter. Thanks for listening.